Darrelle Revis, Joe Klecko, the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and the Jets are taking it over, and we have the perfect guest to go through it all. Let's get this started. Zoinks! It is unequivocally the Super Bowl for New York Jet fans.
Field Yates, baby. Field gosh darn Yates. Let's bring him on the show.
Come on, people. Connor Rogers is joining the show. What's up, Connor? But Trevor gosh darn Sycamore, baby, for me, personally, my favorite New York Jet of all time.
Wow, it's great to be on. What an intro that was right there.
Paul, nobody does an intro like you, man.
Paul, you give the best intro of literally any podcast that I've ever been.
I'm gonna lose my gosh darn bananas.
Hey everybody, my name is Paul Esden Jr., a.k.a. Boy Green. I'm the New York Jets digital reporter for Heavy.com, and I'm so excited for this guest. I've been a fan of this man for a very long time, and our first time getting to chat on the show, so let's bring him in. Another longtime columnist, of course, a noted sports author, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Gary Myers graces us with his presence. How are we, Gary?
Doing great, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing excellent, Gary, this has been a question that's been on my mind for years, and I'm curious if you can answer it. I'm sure you can. Why did you make it such a personal case for you that to lobby and argue and advocate for Joe Klecko? Because Joe Klecko said, quote unquote, you pushed it over the top for him to ultimately be enshrined here in just a handful of weeks at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Why did you make it your personal mission to be a representative for Joe Klecko?
Well, Paul, I wanted to right or wrong. And I thought that Joe should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago. In his 20 years of eligibility as a modern era candidate, I was surprised he didn't make it. That was prior to me even being on the committee, so I couldn't advocate for him at that point. And I got named to the senior committee 3-4 years ago, in addition to being on the modern era committee. And I kind of made it a mission to at least raise the awareness about what a great career that Joe had. And I felt that he was overlooked and deserved every consideration as a senior candidate. And it took a couple of years, but, I'm very happy for Joe that he's going to be enshrined in Canton in a month or so.
Gary, why did you believe that he got overlooked? Of course, Joe isn't the only one. That's probably why the senior committee was, brought about in the first place. But why Joe Klecko specifically? Why did he fall through the cracks? He seems so obvious to some of us on the outside, but maybe not so much, obviously, to the committee over the years.
Well, I mean, basically, I felt he deserved it. And that, like you mentioned, there are a lot of players that slip through the cracks and make it into the senior pool. And it's very hard to get out of the senior pool, because there's just so many great players in there. Mm-hmm. And, he and Darrelle Revis, two best defensive players in Jets history. It wasn't Joe's fault that the Jets did not make it to the Super Bowl during his career. I think one thing that held him back was sacks were not counted as an official stat until 1982. So I kind of did some research and found out how many sacks he had prior to being an official stat. And instead of him being presented on websites such as NFL.com with 24 and a half career sacks, the real number, I think it was like 74 and a half or 75, something like that. He had a lot of sacks early in his career. He had, I think it was 20 and a half in 1981. He was just a great player, Pro Bowl, 3 different positions, and made the All-Pro at a couple of positions. He just kind of jumped off the page at me. And it wasn't because he played for the Jets and I live in New York. It's just that I felt he was one of those guys that didn't get the recognition that he deserved. So once I got on the senior committee, and I had the first year, there were 9 of us. The last couple of years, I think there's been 12. So I had one of those votes. I felt like I needed to leverage that and use whatever influence I had to educate the other voters about how qualified and deserving Joe was.
And Gary, what was I don't know if you can just spit back out the speech, but you must be some influential guy. You were able to sway the room and eventually get him over the hump. What did you say that changed your mind? And I know they're not always the same minds, but he didn't make it on the modern era ballot, and then now you're reselling the pitch. His career had been over for a long time, but you were able to sell those guys ultimately on getting him through this time around. What made the difference this time?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that the voters are, there's a turnover in vote. Not a big turnover on a yearly basis. People who get on the committee want to stay on the committee. But I would venture to guess on the senior committee, there weren't more than 2 or 3 or 4 who were on the modern era committee back when Joe was eligible. I felt I had a lot of material to work with, that Joe's career kind of stands on its own. And it was just up to me to, like I said before, to educate the other voters about what an outstanding career he had, and made some comparisons to other players, defensive linemen who are already in the Hall of Fame that I thought Joe measured up to. And he made the point of how versatile he was in becoming the first defensive player to make the Pro Bowl at 3 different positions, 3 distinctly different positions: defensive end, defensive tackle, and then nose tackle. And how he was just a great player at all 3. And then the other thing I think I did that really was had a lot of influence was, I spoke to Anthony Munoz, who I think is the best tackle who ever played, John Hanna, who I consider to be the best guard who ever played, and then Dwight Stevenson, who probably would have been considered the best center ever if it wasn't for the fact that injuries shortened his career. He's still in that conversation for sure, but I think it would have been a no-brainer if he had played a little bit longer. So I spoke to each of those guys who all played a lengthy amount of time against Joe. It wasn't like 1 or 2 games or 1 or 2 years, but several years and a lot of games. And they were all, fully endorsing Joe as one of the best players they ever won against, and that he was, so deserving of being in the Hall of Fame. And I do think that if you're quoting players to advocate for a candidate, you can't go to guys on the same team. Like Marty Lyons could talk for the next 10 days why Joe deserved it, but that's his buddy, and he played next to him. You have to go to guys who played against him, who aren't necessarily going to advocate for him. They're going to speak the truth. These players don't want players who aren't deserving to be in the Hall of Fame. And I just found, all the players I spoke to just spoke glowingly about Joe. And I think that went a long way to convincing the other voters that Joe was deserving.
Who better to check the pulse than fellow Pro Football Hall of Famers to say, yeah, that guy's pretty good. Hopefully, and obviously that worked in the sales job. I'm curious, do you think this is a potential reason is, again, maybe why it took so long? In Joe Klecko's 11 seasons with the Jets, they only made the playoffs 4 times. So it's sometimes a little bit easier for the teams that either have Super Bowl success going all the way to the top or playoff success where they're shoved in your face all the time. It makes them a little bit more memorable. Even being in New York, obviously, can sometimes not be enough if you're not having that team playoff success. Was that a potential thing?
The exposure you get from being on a Super Bowl team, especially one that wins it, I do think goes a long way. It's not fair. I think quarterbacks and coaches are the 2 positions, 2 jobs that most reflective on a team's success. How they do usually can really push a team to great success. To lay that at the feet of a defensive lineman and say, well, he didn't get to a Super Bowl, so he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. It's really, I don't think that's fair. And certainly it wasn't Joe's fault that Richard Todd threw 5 interceptions in that AFC Championship game. And people, I really brought this out. Joe tore the patella tendon in his knee in the second game of the 82 season. It was a strike year, so he had surgery the night of the second game, and then he couldn't even rehab at the Jets facility because none of the players can show up there because the strike was going on. So he had a rehab on his own, and then he made it back in time for the playoffs, which is unheard of with a torn patella tendon. And so he played all 3 playoff games, including that AFC Championship game on that really wet field in Miami. And, if Richard Todd had not turned it over 5 times, the Jets might have won that game. They lost 14-0, and giving the other team 5 turnovers in a championship game is a pretty good recipe for losing. So I made that point that, he was a warrior, and I know that's an overused expression, but Joe really sacrificed his body to play football. The number of injuries and surgeries he's had, especially since his career has ended, is it's mind-boggling. And he gave his body to the game, and he did it not because somebody pushed him to, but that was his mentality. And he was a great player also. So he had so much going for him that I think he really stood out to the other senior voters.
And Gary, you mentioned it a little bit earlier in our conversation. Obviously, for the people, and you've said this in other interviews, that if people looked at Joe Klecko's stats on NFL.com or what have you, they'd see that marginal production, relatively speaking, at 24 and a half sacks and go, hey, what's the big deal with this guy? But then again, when you consider that the sack stat 1982, Klecko came in 77, there's this big gap of time, but you were able to, and I'm not, insulting you, Garrett, you were able to do it. Why couldn't the NFL say, okay, we have the technology, you have the stuff to be able to look at it through it historically. Why can't all those pre-1982 sacks become an official statistic? It's on Pro Football Reference now.
Right.
Why can't that be a thing? Because that could also help future senior committee candidates and the like.
That's really a great point. And Pro Football Reference, as you mentioned, Paul, has updated their stats prior to 1982, sacks at least. I'm not sure what else they've updated. Yeah. So I think that's been very helpful to voters when they go back and, for comparison purposes, to check on that. It was really up to the teams prior to 82 to keep those kind of records. Okay. And the guys sitting in the press box keeping the official stats, they at that point, it wasn't an official stat. And did anybody add on a sack or a couple of tackles here and there? I don't think they did it intentionally, but that may not have been correct in what they did. Right. And there was no double checking in those days. And a lot of times now you'll get updates on the official stats on Tuesday or Wednesday, instead of a full sack on TJ Watt, they'll split it between TJ Watt and a teammate after they review the film. That was not going on in those days, and so they weren't taking the team's numbers as gospel. I'm not really sure, where Pro Football Reference, if they're double checking. that would be a job that would take years, I would imagine. But in Klecko's case, I think it was really important, Paul, to point out that, all right, he didn't have a lot of sacks from 82 to 88. It had a lot to do with the fact that he moved to inside to defensive tackle and then nose tackle, and the majority of his sacks came at defensive end. But it's not like it didn't happen. It just wasn't an official stat, for goodness sake. So it just had to be brought to the front of these voters' minds that, all right, it's not official, so maybe these numbers are off by a few here or there, but it's not like it's off by 50%. So, listen, I've done this now for 11 or 12 years, and a bunch of players who've gotten in who I've made the presentation speech for. I'm as happy or happier for Joe than I am for anybody else that I've advocated for in the Hall of Fame, just because he waited such a long time. And he really deserved this 25, 30 years ago.
Well, let me ask you, as we're going through this, Gary, again, we're speaking with Gary Myers here on the program. We're going to get to, he is a noted author, and we're going to talk about one of his new books that will be coming out this fall. But do you think with Joe Klecko waiting so long, according to the Pro Football Hall of Fame website, it is officially year of eligibility number 30, which obviously he had been done since a long time ago. I ask you, when Klecko finally got the word, is it excitement? Is it relief? Thank goodness it's finally over? Because there's been some herky-jerky nature over the years where he thinks maybe there's a chance. And then after getting beaten down for so long, you probably kind of naturally kind of pull yourself back and you don't want to get too invested.
Well, I think Joe had a great attitude about this. At least when I was speaking to him, we talked a lot the last 3-4 years.
Yeah.
He, if it happened, he'd be overjoyed. Obviously, if it didn't happen, life goes on. And I don't know if he was being entirely truthful with me about that. I know how important this was to him, and what player doesn't want to have his career validated and have his bust in Canton? I mean, that's the ultimate recognition of what a great career a player has. So I think he was downplaying it sort of as a defense mechanism, and I understand that. That's human nature. But
Sure.
when he found out for sure officially that he was in, he was pretty happy. Now you have to remember that we did the voting last August and came
Right.
with 3 finalists, and Ken Riley and Chuck Halley were the other 2. All 3 can get in. It wasn't like at that point they were competing against each other. You know, we had narrowed it down from an initial list of 125 down to 25, then to 12 finalists, and the 12 finalists we discussed on a Zoom call. So I have only been part of maybe one senior candidate not getting the final vote when we all get together in January. So when Joe and I talked about it last August, I said, hey, you're in. He goes, I'm not taking anything for granted. Until I find out that it's official and the entire committee voted for me, that I got the 80% vote, I'm not celebrating. I'm not doing anything. I said, fine, I understand that, but you're in. You know, there's no way you're not going to get the vote. And obviously he got the vote, but he didn't want to take a chance. I mean, like I said, there have been 1 or 2 guys that got to that stage that Joe got to in January and then had the ultimate disappointment. So he was protecting himself against that, but he's as happy as anybody about getting in the Hall of Fame. And it's so great because you know what? It's one thing if you get in your first or second year of eligibility and you've only been out of the game 7 years because you got to wait 5 years before you're eligible.
Correct. Right.
So it almost feels like a continuation of your career. Mm-hmm. This is almost like a rebirth for Joe because all these years later, he's doing all these interviews and his name is in, you know, a lot of stories. And then he'll have that weekend in Canton where people go, oh, Joe Klecko, that's right. He was a tremendous player. So it's almost like a relaunch for him, which I think he would trade for have gotten in 25 years ago, but it's really not a bad consolation prize.
That's funny. That was a question I was going to go into because, again, we have these polar opposites. It's a wonderful New York Jets Hall of Fame weekend, which we'll get into. Revis, first year of eligibility. Again, his career just ended. He's 37. I believe he turns 38 next month. Like, he's just a guppy in the relative, speaking of our human lives. And then you have Klecko, who's going to be a 70-year-old man later this year. I wonder, did it affect the experience, whether good or bad, waiting that long? You know, they say, you know, abstinence makes a heart grow fonder, waiting that long to get the ultimate prize, the ultimate recognition of, you know, being enshrined to football immortality and that sort of thing. In your opinion, is there a difference? Is there some, again, I'm sure Klecko would have preferred it a long time ago, but now that this is the reality, do you think there's almost even a more treasured thing to this?
Yeah, now I'm not going to say Darrell took it for granted.
Right.
Because it wasn't a lock that he was going to get in the first year. It was a lock he was going to get in. Mm-hmm. So, and he appreciates everything that's come his way, this honor. Because he got in the first year, it puts him in a special category of players who have gotten in his first year. It's very hard to do that. But I truly think Joe appreciates it on a level that few people can understand. When you wait so long for something like this, the ultimate honor that a football player can have. And I'm sure there was a point there that he said, this just isn't happening for me. And for it to happen now is, I do think he's much more, I don't want to compare him to Revis because I know Darrell is really appreciative and this means the world to him.
Yeah.
But logically speaking, it can't mean as much as it does to Klecko because Klecko had to wait so long. And, you know, one thing I want to point out to you, and Joe has given me a lot of credit, as you know, you've mentioned. And
yes, of course.
And, you know, that's fine. I appreciate it. It's one of the fallacies of the Hall of Fame system is that there's 12 of us on the senior committee. Mm-hmm. And it certainly helps to have a voter who knows you and is going to advocate for you and really push hard for you. Just think, like I mentioned, there's like 100 this year. There might have been 198 on the initial list that we then vote down to 25, and that's the process we're in now. We haven't gotten the list of 25 yet.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have one of the 12 voters who you know is going to the wall for you, it really helps. Is that fair to the other 197 who are, probably a good percentage of them are qualified? Not going to say all of them, but certainly a good percentage. Is that fair? Probably not. But that's just the process. So again, I'm not going to say I'm responsible for getting Joe in because he was a great player and he deserved to get in regardless of who's making the presentation. But it definitely benefited him to have me on the committee or anybody else that would have pushed hard for him, because nobody else on that committee necessarily would have said, okay, I'm really going to push hard for Joe Klecko. If his name comes up, yeah, I can be convinced to vote for him. But you need somebody really pushing for you straight through the process to get you to the point that you get into that room of 12 people, not literally in the room because they're not there,
right?
But to have your case discussed, you need somebody that's really in your corner to get you that far. And then you need that person to make a really convincing argument, which I think I did for Joe. So, I mean, I don't take credit for anything. It's just that I'm just saying the way the system is set up, you need to have somebody like me, whoever the player is, who really believes in you.
Absolutely. And Gary, I ask you, did you ever lose faith? Like, obviously you can, as Klecko's been through it on that side, but as a advocate for Joe Klecko, with all the time that has passed and all the wonderful names that you mentioned and even didn't mention that are in that list that you guys were, kind of methodically plotting down, like that, there's a lot of good names. So there was a great chance it could have been, instead of Joe Klecko, this other really well-deserving candidate. Did you ever lose faith during the process that maybe despite your advocacy that maybe it just wasn't going to come to fruition?
No, and the reason for that is I've only been on the senior committee for 3 years.
Right.
And whereas as a member of the minor era committee, I could have written letters on Joe's behalf to the senior committee. We get a lot of letters, and I tend to skim them over. I do read them.
Yeah.
But, there's a lot of people that send letters on the behalf of players, whether it's other voters or just former teammates and stuff like that. So I only been on the committee, 3 or so years. And after the first couple of years, I felt like I had done a good job on my presentation to Joe. It just wasn't his year. The other guys that were waiting longer or whatnot. We only, I think it was last year, increased it to 3 seniors a year. I'm losing track of the years. This is the first or second year that we did 3 seniors. And so I knew I was very confident that Joe would get in one of those 3 years that we were going to elect 3 seniors. So instead of getting discouraged, I was actually encouraged because the year before this one, he made it pretty far in the voting and didn't get it. So I felt going into the voting for the class of 2023, I really felt if he wasn't first, he was second going in. And I thought Ken Riley also had a really, really good chance. We're not privy to the final votes, so I don't know who ultimately got the most votes, but all I know is Joe is in the top 3, and that's all I cared about.
100%. Garrett, I need you to, this is a random detour, but it's something as a Hall of Fame football historian that I am, I always advocate for on my radio show, is I believe that, of the first ballot Hall of Famers that get in, like obviously anyone who gets in is a Hall of Famer, but I've argued on the radio that like all the people that get in first ballot, it's almost like an asterisk. It's almost like the club within the club, a wink, wink among Hall of Famers. And I have my longtime former columnist buddy, Bud Poliquin, who argues against it and thinks I'm an idiot. So Gary, I need you to solve this thing for me. Do you believe that there is this almost 1% in the Hall of Fame, almost a special group within the group that is almost even on a little bit of a higher pedestal, or do you just not view it in that way?
Well, Deion Sanders would like to have a different room for who he considers to be the best of the best.
Right.
I'll tell you what I told Harry Carson when he got in his 13th season, year of eligibility, rather.
Yeah.
I said, Harry, they don't have you stand on the stage based on, okay, everybody who's the first ballot stand here, second year
Right.
here, third year. You don't sign your autograph, Harry Carson, HOF. I got in my 13th year.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a differentiation that I've noticed among the Hall of Famers. They don't separate them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do the other guys know who got it in the first year? Some of them probably do. I don't know that many pay that close attention to it. They all know who's in. I don't think they're keeping score at home, who gets in the first year, the second year, the third year, whatever like that. So an awful big deal has been made out of first ballot Hall of Famers. And I go into every year that we get down to the finalists, and I'm voting for the guys who I think are the 5 most deserving. I don't care how many years they've been waiting or if it's their first year of eligibility. If I think they're among I don't believe, well, this guy's been waiting a long time, he should jump over a first year guy because that guy's going to get in anyhow. That's not how I look at it. I can't say how everybody else looks at it. I just feel I voted for the 5 who I think are the most deserving. And if you've been waiting 7 years and a guy who I think is a better player, who had a better career, is now coming along, I'm going to jump that guy over you. And, for your sake, hopefully you'll get in a different year.
That's the way it should be, Gary. That is, I'm sure you know it. It's a common myth among fans is that, this guy's long overdue. So boop, 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 as they're trying to guesstimate and speculate on who's going to be in a certain year, looking ahead at first ballot guys are coming in. Oh, that guy has to be in. They sometimes play that game in fans on social media. So it's good to know, at least I know you're not voting for everybody, but in your particular case, I think that makes sense. The fairest way to do it. Because then we could get in some murky waters pretty quick if that's how people start to think about it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, right now we have a logjam at wide receiver.
Yes.
Between Andre Johnson, Reggie Wayne, and Torrey Holt. And I'm trying to remember if we had another receiver that wasn't in that group. Well, in any event, there's a lot of people that feel let's break the logjam. Let's get one guy in this year, one guy in next year, one guy the year after, because you can make a case that all 3 deserve. And we had a situation with Chris Carter, Tim Brown, and Andre Reed a few years ago. It was exactly the same thing.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then I think Chris was the first of the 3, then Andre, and then Tim Brown. So I think it just happened naturally that they came off the board one year after the other. And, but some people want to make deals. Okay, let's decide who the best of the 3 receivers is. Let's vote for him this year to get him out of the way. Then the next year we'll vote for the next guy. So all 3 will get in. And I'm going, wait a minute. I'm not sure I want all 3 in.
Yeah.
So I don't make any deals, and most people don't. That was actually brought up in the meeting room last year, like how we going to do this. And I'm just saying it's going to happen organically. When one of those 3 guys is one of the 5 most deserving players of the players we're considering, they'll get in. And then we'll see what happens to the other 2. And maybe 2 will get in this year. I haven't even started work on this year's class, so I don't even know. But it's not supposed to be easy. Right.
As it shouldn't be, quite frankly. What I think Klecko said the number in a recent interview, 370. Is that what we're at now? Out of the,
and that's not even all players, because a lot of owners, coaches,
contributors, coaches, 100% ownership. There's a lot of different ways that you could get in. So again, I feel like it's a pretty elite group, and that's how it should be. Again, it shouldn't be again. We should be having these conversations. Oh my God, how is this guy not in the Hall of Fame yet? Like, I want to have that. If we're not having that, I feel like we've turned them into saloon doors in Canton, Ohio, which is not where we want to be. A couple more, Gary, before we get you out of here. Revis, it was interesting that you said that you did not perceive him as this slam dunk candidate. Do you consider him the best quarterback of all time? Maybe by virtue of him not being slam dunk, he isn't. But I thought that was an interesting comment, because people have been kind of split on that.
Yeah, no, I did think that he was deserving of getting in the first year. I'm just saying, in hearing some of the arguments in the room, I was confident he was going to get it, but I didn't think it was a no-brainer like the year that Jerry Rice was in, whoever made the presentation just stood up, said Jerry Rice, and sat down. I thought I had to make a convincing argument for Revis in order for him to get enough votes to get in the first year. But I think he's definitely deserving. What I'm surprised didn't come up, Paul, in our conversation. Revis was outstanding for like 4 seasons. I mean, just great, especially 2009 and 10, and then he played really well in helping the Patriots win that Super Bowl and breaking a 10-year drought of not winning it. But it didn't end pretty for him in New York, as you know. He didn't play particularly well in Tampa because it was the first year after the ACL. So I really thought that a lot of the voters were going to hit me with, well, okay, we'll give you that. Maybe he should have won Defensive Player of the Year in 2009, and he had this amazing streak in 2010 where he kept shutting down the best receivers. Okay, that's 2 years. 11, he tore his ACL in the 3rd week. 12 was the Tampa year. No, maybe I'm getting these years wrong. 12 was when he tore his ACL. 13 was the Tampa year. 14 was New England, and then 15 and 16 back with the Jets, and 17 just a handful of games at the end of the season with Kansas City. So he really didn't do much after the 2014 season, and then he was off the charts great in 2009 and 10. Very good his rookie year. Really good in 2008. That's when the buildup started. It wasn't Revis Island yet, but that's where the buildup started. So I thought I was going to be hearing, okay, he was great, but he didn't sustain it. And I mean, I was prepared for the counter argument to that.
Yeah.
But, we had the Darrelle Revis standard that was set a few years ago. So we can't really say, and Davis had fewer great years than Revis did. He was just amazing in the playoffs. But we kind of established new parameters by letting Darrelle Revis go in. Unheard of for a player with that few great seasons.
The only one I can think of is the Kansas Comet, Gale Sayers, right? What did he have? 6 years, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they were very, very similar. I think that Sayers was considered, and I hate this term, but I'm going to use it. He was considered generational talent, where I don't think anybody looked at Darrelle Revis as that. They looked at him as he was amazing, and he helped Elway win 2 Super Bowls that he couldn't win without him. So, Revis, unfortunately, had the ACL. And then when he got back to the Jets in 2015, he suffered a wrist injury that required surgery after the 15 season. And he was a really physical corner. He wasn't one of these guys that can run a 4.3 40. He wasn't slow, but it wasn't like he was a real speed guy. But he's really had good separation. I mean, good catch-up speed, and had great ball skills. Even though he didn't have a lot of interceptions, he was always around the ball. But what separated him, Paul, was that he was really physical in the 5-yard zone that you're allowed to put your hands on the receiver. And when he lost that ability to do that because of his wrists, he became a different player and had to rely more on his speed. And that's why I think you saw him get beat deep a lot in those 2 years with the Jets, because he had catch-up speed, but he didn't have great catch-up speed. So if he fell behind by 2 steps, he wasn't the kind of guy that was going to close that gap necessarily with the ball in the air. He really relied more on knocking guys off their routes or being able to run their routes with them after slowing them down at the line. And he wasn't able to do that after he got hurt with the Jets. And his last year with the Jets, was way below what we had become accustomed to from him.
Oh, 100%. Let me ask you this. This one's kind of interesting because, the Pro Football Hall of Fame is supposed to be just football, but I always remember Ricky Watters for who, for what. And then I think about, Revis with the contract holdout stuff. It painted this bad picture on social media and stuff. Is any of that kind of extracurricular activities factored in? Is it not supposed to be factored in, but it naturally gets factored in because we're humans, we're not robots making these decisions?
That's an interesting point. I mean, where the mandate is, it's what happens on Sundays or Mondays or Thursdays or Saturdays. And then depending if your game gets flexed at the last minute from Sunday to Thursday, right? Right. But you can't get into the minds of all 49 or 50
Right.
voters. And, that was the problem Terrell Owens had, rather.
Oh, yes.
Terrell Owens had. We're told that, if a guy's a jerk or he's a problem in the locker room or gets arrested, which he didn't. I'm just
Right,
maybe like
that's
in the case
correct.
of Lawrence Taylor, that's not supposed to count. But we were told in Owens' case that the locker room was an extension of the playing field.
Oh,
which
interesting.
I thought was very, very interesting. So I think that had a lot to do with why it took him until his third year to get in, because you would have to be blind not to realize that
the numbers
what
speak
happened
for
in San
themselves.
Francisco, Philadelphia, Dallas,
Yeah.
turned on all his quarterbacks, became a cancer in the locker room,
Yeah.
and basically got thrown off of each team.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you take that into consideration with all his stats, which no doubt were Hall of Fame numbers,
Of course.
I think that prevented him from going in the first year. Now, the interesting thing is the year that he finally went in, he was with Randy Moss.
Who was first year. Correct. Right.
And you can easily make the argument that Randy Moss was just as disruptive as Owens. In fact, Moss was in the perfect situation in New England with a quarterback, the greatest quarterback ever, who loved him. And he made himself so miserable over his money that he wound up getting traded, back to the Vikings. And that didn't last very long. And then his career from there just kind of fell off a cliff, even though he made it to a Super Bowl with the 49ers and they didn't win the game. He at that point, he really wasn't much of a factor. He had a great situation in New England, and I think he blew it. Owens had a great situation in San Francisco. He had an amazing situation in Philadelphia. The fans there, who were really tough on players, loved him.
Yeah.
McNabb was thrilled to have him. He turned on McNabb halfway through the season, and then their relationship totally deteriorated. He gets to Dallas. He's crying about Tony Romo if you remember that. After they
That's my quarterback.
My quarterback. And the next year, he's accusing Romo of conspiring with Jason Witten not to throw him the ball. So, that's one of those guys that never appreciated, I think, what he had. No matter what was happening, he felt slighted and was going to be miserable no matter what situation he was in.
You did lift the veil for me, though, because forever another Hall of Fame argument I always yell about on the radio is T.O. getting in on his third year of eligibility, but never having off-the-field issues outside of doing apparently sit-ups in his driveway for the media. While Randy Moss, I brought it up on the show, I printed out 2 or 3 sheets of paper of all the stuff, whether from college to pros, of stuff off the field. But if the perception was, hey, technically the locker room is an extension of the field and that's how it's perceived, then that immediately clarifies why those two are, because Randy Moss's issues were off the field and in theory cannot be studied or part of the case. So now all of a sudden that makes all the sense of the world. If that was the rationale and reasoning, I'm like, okay, now that makes more sense. So Gary, you've cleared that up for me.
Like I said, I was really surprised when they clarified it for us.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't on the committee when Lawrence Taylor got in, but it was very clear that they were telling all the voters his drug issues during his career and after his career and any other indiscretions, you're not to consider that at all, because he was not a problem in the locker room. He played his butt off every game, played hurt, and was one of the greatest players in NFL history. I consider him to be the greatest defensive player in NFL history. But there was some pushback against him from some of the voters who felt, we can't reward this guy because of what happened off the field. Now, they were told not to consider that, but, it's a secret ballot. And you don't know. You don't know.
Well, Gary, the final one here, and I think I already know the answer to this question. I assume, of course, you're going to the Pro Football Hall of Fame for this Jets takeover. They'll be featured in the Hall of Fame game, of course, on that Thursday night, Jets-Browns. We'll have a both modern and old school Jets guys, so Jet fans are going to be all over the place. Do you have any special, if you are going, do you have any special plans? Are you and Klecko getting dinner? Are you guys doing something special for this momentous occasion, both in Jets franchise history, but obviously for the individuals and their families and Revis and Klecko?
Yeah, I'll go to the induction ceremony. No, I don't go every year.
Okay.
But my wife and I get to take a nice drive This year, we're going to stop at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland
Nice.
and drive to Canton and go to the induction ceremony on Saturday. And then Joe invited me to his party Saturday night, and Darrell did also. So we'll take those in and then take a leisurely drive back to New York.
All right.
Yeah, Joe,
Well,
both those guys are going to be so busy. The Hall of Fame has them doing a bunch of stuff. I'm not bothering them for any individual time with them. I don't need that. I know they appreciate the hard work I put in for them in making these presentations, and that's good enough for me. I don't need any public recognition for them, at any of these events. I'm just happy they're both going to achieve this, wonderful honor.
Well, Gary, I just got to say, I know you don't want it. You're being very modest, but I'm just saying, we all know, all of us are going to be, when Klecko's up there, we're going to give, try to find you in the crowd and go, hello. We know that you're responsible for the Klecko love. But, Gary, before we get you out of here, I could see it over your left shoulder there. Once a Giant. I know this is a Jet show, but I'm going to be honest, Gary. I'm a fan of your work regardless.
It's actually my right shoulder, Paul. It's my right shoulder.
Oh, right shoulder. Oh, I see. Okay. But this Once a Giant action, I'm really
you're right. It
curious.
is my left. I thought the Giant one was over here. You're right. It's my left shoulder.
That's okay. Yeah, I accept your apology, Gary. That's all right. But like I said, this is a Jet show. But even regardless of that, Gary, I've been a fan of your work for a long time, whatever you're writing about. And the Jets and Giants have a very special relationship in themselves. You've written a lot of books. This is another great one that's coming out September 12th, later this fall. Once a Giant. What inspired this? Give us some plugs. Give us some thoughts on this, because you write a lot of books. Obviously, we can see a couple of them behind you there. But why this? Why now?
Well, if I'll start off by saying, if any Jet fans who are watching this, appreciate any influence that I had in getting Revis and Klecko in, the way they can thank me is by buying this book. Even though it's about the Giants.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Here's what inspired me to do it. I really wanted to write about life after football, and it's become such a big issue with CTE and all the other physical issues that these players face. So I really wanted to do a book on that. And it's become, the last 10 years, it's just become probably the most important issue for players of today and yesterday. And I wanted to write about a group that was in their 50s and 60s. So instead of, and I would call it cherry picking players from around the league, taking a guy who played for the Seahawks, somebody from the 49ers, the Browns, the Jets, the Giants, the Cowboys, etc. I wanted to concentrate on one team. And the team I chose was the 86 Giants, because I always wanted to, in addition to wanting to write about the subject, I always wanted to do a New York-centric book, because I grew up here. I spent almost my entire life here, except for the 8 years that I covered the Cowboys in Dallas. And I know a lot of these 86 Giants from that period of time, even though I was working in Dallas in 1986. But these guys are very visible around town, and many of them was still on the team in 1989 when I moved back to New York to work for the Daily News. So it kind of gave me a head start that I had good relationships with a lot of these players. But it really could be a book about any team from that era, and they're all going through the same things. So where it's about the Giants, it's not a recap of that 86 season, which might be painful for Jet fans, considering the Jets were 10-1 and people thought it was going to be a Jet-Giants Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So it's about the Giants, but it's about life. And it's really about the price that these guys pay. Even though they weren't making the money back then that players are making today, they were still making a lot of money relative to what everybody else is making. So it's a trade-off between, the level of being famous and adored and becoming idols that these guys have experienced then, versus the price they paid for it with artificial hips and shoulders and knees and memory loss, and in some cases dementia, financial problems, mental health issues. And there's all of that in this book. And I don't want anybody to think the book is going to get you depressed. It's just, I also talk about the brotherhood that was formed among these players in it's a pre-free agency days. So the foundation of the team was just built upon every year rather than turned over every year. So by the time they got to 1986, they were pretty tight. And then achieving the ultimate, winning a Super Bowl together, bonded them for life. And they really do care for each other. They take care of each other. Some players are very hesitant to go to doctor's appointments. Harry Carson took Jim Burt to his first doctor's appointment 5 or so years after his career was over, because Jim was afraid of going to doctors. They get a text chain going if somebody is in need, and they rally in support. So I really think I tell people, Paul, it's filled with heartwarming, but also heartbreaking stories. And I really tried to achieve a balance in telling them, because I wasn't going to shy away from the purpose of writing the book, which was to really shed light on what it's like to be a former football player in your mid to late 50s to your mid to late 60s, versus, boy, we had so much fun when we were together in that locker room, and those practical jokes we played on each other. You don't get that in any line of work. And I think it's more true in football than any other sport, that these guys truly became a brotherhood. And this is my 6th book. I was fortunate enough, you can see over there my Brady Manning book there in the corner.
Oh yeah, I have that right there on my shelf. Yes.
That became a Times bestseller, which I was very appreciative of. That's like the Hall of Fame for me if you become a Times bestseller.
Yes.
This book that I just wrote, and I'm just saying this because the materials is great, because these players are so open and forthcoming with me. This is by far my best book.
Wow.
And it's also by far my most important book, because it really does address a very serious topic, but mixes in the lighthearted stuff to show you who these players really are. It by no means is a rehash of the 1986 season. There's mentions of some games in there, but just relative to the players I'm talking about, like Bobby Johnson talking about that catch on 4th and 17, Bavaro dragging half the 49ers defense. You might be too young to remember all this stuff in that game in San Francisco. So I talk about plays, but just really in respect to how it made that player, that was his legacy when I talk about certain plays. But it doesn't take you through on first down and second down, and they got a first down, they punted.
Right.
I don't have that kind of game detail in there, because it's just those books have been written, and it just wasn't necessary for me to go back over it again. But I really, listen, I know we've got a Jets audience here for the most part.
Yeah.
But I really think that all football fans and all sports fans really will enjoy this book, because I do think it's pretty enlightening and compelling.
Well, I'm sold. You did the pitch for Klecko. That's sold. Well, you just sold me.
September 12th it becomes available. September 12th.
September 12th. I will just say also thank you for including the Peyton Manning Brady shot in there. I really appreciated the Bill Parcells Peyton Manning almost coulda woulda shoulda. Gary, you almost killed me when I read that in the book the first time, but that's okay. We'll try to pretend that never happened, and that was never even a possibility. That's what we'll try to do.
That's probably a good idea.
Well, Gary, congratulations on the book. It sounds amazing. And when you sell me on that, I fell in love with the Manning Brady book and so many other wonderful books that you've read. But now telling me that this Once a Giant is going to be the best one that you've ever done, I mean, I have no other choice but to run to any bookstore online to get my grubby little hands on Once a Giant as soon as it's available on September 12th this fall. So congratulations on that. And thank you so much for carving out the time for a very in-depth interview on a variety of topics. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Paul. Anytime.
All right, there he is. Gary Myers joining us here on the program. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you.